Hello and welcome back to the Age of Scotland Institute's student-led podcast series. My name is Eleanor Channer. I'm an intern at the ASI, and I'm joined here today by Dr. Ruby Wang to discuss China and the future of global health aid. Welcome, Ruby. Thank you for joining us today. Could I ask you to introduce yourself to our listeners, please?
Thanks so much, Eleanor. It's such a pleasure to be here. My name is Ruby. I'm an NHS trained practicing doctor and founder of LINTRIS Health, which is a cross-border consultancy that supports global clients across governments, NGOs, investors, companies, particularly those in the West, on how to navigate China and Asia in health policy, biopharma, and health tech. I also sit on the Digital Health Council at the UK Royal Society of Medicine and previously served as head of health for the British Embassy in Beijing during the COVID pandemic, as well as health advisor for the United Nations RC in China, and also held roles in health tech across strategies and partnerships in particular, including for Alibaba and with startups. And alongside my advisory work now, I also write and publish on China's health quite regularly, including at the China Health Pulse newsletter, where I unpack what this huge nation's evolving health role means for the rest of the world. And I'm working on a book on this topic as well. So my work always sits at the intersection of health and geopolitics and innovation, and always hopefully with a cross-border lens. I'm really interested in bringing more diverse perspectives into how global health is understood and built. So I'm really delighted that we're talking about this today.
Brilliant, thank you. Very well qualified to be discussing the future of global health today then. To give our listeners a little bit of context, could you just start by explaining what global health aid actually involves and why China is an important actor in the discussion surrounding global health aid?
Yeah, I think this is a really great question, Eleanor, and it's really been hitting the headlines. Why this debate and why now? I think it's almost become a reflex in that when the US seems to be pulling back from global leadership, whether that's intentional or not, and not only in global health, but also in biotech, in AI, in EVs, semiconductors, and so on, headlines start asking, is China replacing the West? Is it filling a vacuum? Is it a competitor that's going to take over, right? And, in global health, there's been a lot of noise about China stepping into the space left by the West, whether that's US aid retreating, UK ODA reducing, European aid being cut. Western donors are significantly scaling back from multilateral institutions, and in most of the Western media commentary that I see, there seems to be this assumption that if China is showing up, that it must be copying the Western model. But I do think that this framing of competition is too simplistic because this isn't how China thinks about power and partnerships, especially in health. I think that China's offering something entirely different, especially in the global health context, which is absolutely rooted in its own history, its own health system reform and development, its own resource constraints, its own cultural contexts, and definitely its own priorities.
So, in your view, then, given with this different approach to aid, what are the key aims of China's global health and development aid?
Yeah, so in terms of China's aims in global health, I've already said I don't think China's trying to replace anything or anyone, but instead, I think China's intentionally introducing a different type of logic, a logic that's designed with its own agenda in mind, very different from traditional Western development models, which have always emphasized multilateral engagement, a promotion of an abstract concept of global public goods, and perceived technical neutrality. I think, in contrast, China much prefers to work through bilateral relationships, state to state, blending health with diplomacy, infrastructure, trade, and prosperity, and it sees global health as part of a broader strategic toolkit. So it's pretty much multiple things all at once. I think part of it, firstly, is prestige. China wants to be seen as a serious and capable global player, and a responsible power, one that can show up, deliver, and build in real terms, because it understands that this matters increasingly in a world where powers are shifting, influence is becoming more and more transactional. In this space, China understands that legitimacy is increasingly earned through competence rather than just rhetoric. And secondly, I think there's a clear economic and political logic, because when China operates abroad, health isn't treated as a siloed technical domain, but folded into much broader agendas, whether that's infrastructure deals, digital governance frameworks, trade policy, or diplomacy, as we've just mentioned. And it becomes a mechanism for building deeper alignment. We've seen this happen in South-South cooperations through, joint CDCs, collaborative vaccine facilities, digital health pilots, and all of this is wrapped into broader strategic partnerships, delivered through a hybrid model that's part state, part private sector, but always aligned to China's core national interests. And this emphasis on state-to-state relationships promotes China's control and an idea of long-term stability. Because I think from China's point of view, public health is an extension of its governance, and not something to outsource or open up easily to global actors without limits. So when China engages abroad, it looks at partnerships to reflect that same approach, whether that's sovereign governments working together with clear boundaries, an idea of mutual respect and predictable outcomes. This is very different from the more abstract idea of multilateral forums, which allow all sides to retain autonomy over pace or structure or agenda. And I think finally, there is good alignment in practical terms as well. We'll probably come on to that later. I think for China, health is a very useful bridge. It's a good technical vehicle for diplomacy and engagement. And there's strategic overlap with developing partners, because China has much more relevant and recent lived experience of how to build health systems, especially compared to Western nations whose health systems matured a long time ago. We know that China's health has transformed so dramatically in just a few decades from, a fragmented, underserved population to now building a system which is much more digitally integrated and rapidly scaled. And so when China's engaging internationally with developing partners, it's bringing what those partners can relate to, with recent memory and real-time learning and models that were designed from the starting point to scale under constraint.
Brilliant. And so on that point of international strategic partnerships, in one of your recent articles on the World Health Organization's Assembly in May, you used the phrase selective multilateralism to describe China's vision for global health. What do you mean by that specific phrase, and how does that differ from Western approaches to global aid and multilateralism?
Yeah, so I think, this year's World Health Assembly marked a real turning point. The US was absent. There were no senior officials present. Funding was cut. And the only appearance by the US was this video from RFK Jr., which criticized the WHO. It was broadcasted to the audience and it felt completely flat, according to anecdotes. So it really seemed like the end of an era for global health, and for the US's role. But in contrast, China stepped forward quite dramatically with big moves. So pledging 500 million US dollars, sending the largest WHA delegation in history, which was, I think, over 180 officials across health ministries, industry. and the delegation was led by the vice premier, which itself was a deliberate signal of the importance Beijing is placing on health diplomacy. And so, in the Nikkei Asia piece you referred to, I described this approach by China as selective multilateralism. By that, I mean that China is engaging in global health carefully and with clear boundaries. It's choosing where to lead, where to co-host, and where to hold back. And at this year's World Health Assembly, that meant taking center stage on topics that strategically align with its domestic priorities and exportable strength. So, hosting major sessions on digital health, which it's very strong in, showing off smart hospitals, AI triage, its mature national digital health infrastructure. China also held the first ever traditional Chinese medicine side event at the WHA. This has always been quite a controversial topic for especially Western member states, but it's always been a political priority for China. And the opportunity to pitch it here as a legitimate technical offering, I think, was a huge win for China. It also got to focus on priority areas in health, such as rare diseases and mental health, where it sees both policy leadership and strategic soft power. And alongside these technical sessions, diplomatic meetings between China and, the global south, including Brazil, Morocco, Indonesia, and others. These help to embed health into a wider agenda of health diplomacy, even in this multilateral event. So I think really smart moves by China, allowing both visibility and validation at the most important global health event of the year. As well as all of this, we saw leaders, including WHO Director General Tedros, giving China strong public praise, highlighting its contribution to the global health stage, welcoming its leadership on South-South cooperation. All of this endorsement really matters for China, especially after the tensions of the pandemic years, where obviously the relationship between China and the WHO were under significant strain. So, this concept of selective multilateralism for China in global health going forward, I think we're likely to see it continue through this specific type of targeted, high leverage engagement where health is both a narrative and a tool with clear lines and self-defined priorities.
And why is this selective multilateral approach particularly attractive to the global south? All these bilateral meetings, how have they been received by these places, like you mentioned, Morocco, etc.?
Yeah, I think this is really the heart of the issue because so much of the commentary around China's quote unquote rise in global health, perhaps because it's written in English and therefore by Western commentators, it misses what so many countries across the global south want and why they're choosing to engage with China in the first place. So, developing countries are still often framed as passive recipients in this landscape, still treated, especially in outdated discourse, as if they're waiting to be led. But in reality, many of these developing governments are actively comparing offers, pragmatically negotiating terms, asserting their own agency, which they have every right to, because their aims are to protect their sovereignty, protect their people's health, and build systems that they believe will work best for them. So I think a simple reason and a technical reason why China's offer makes sense to them is that China's delivery models are fast, cost efficient, scalable, and often more practical. They reflect experiences that feel more familiar and relevant, how to build under pressure, how to deliver care across uneven terrains for vast populations, which are difficult to access across remote regions, and how to blend public and private systems to get things done, not only to address health burdens, but also to promote prosperity and boost economic growth. So, you know, the concerns about governance dependency and values for China are significant and very valid. And I think these developing governments are clear-eyed about long-term reliance. They are worried about Chinese financing, whether deals might lock them into infrastructure they can't later change, whether that's physical infrastructure like hospitals, manufacturing, or whether that's digital health infrastructure. They're concerned about opaque contract terms, implications of data control, or political leverage. But I think they are weighing those risks consciously, and they are able to make calculated decisions on what gets them the capacity they need and at the speed and cost that they need it. So they're making informed choices based on those terms. And at the end of the day, China is offering often the most realistic path to getting those systems off the ground, especially as health burdens are ever rising and the needs are ever more urgent. They're recognizing what China can bring practically, especially because China is oftentimes not framing its support with what might be seen as moral lectures or conditionality or legacy baggage of, aid dependency on Western terms, which I think matters more than people realize.
So you mentioned that Chinese aid is often faster, more and more easily scalable than other than Western alternatives, for instance. What is it specifically about Chinese aid that makes that the case?
I think there's one interesting part of it, which is China's world leading, I think, moves in health and technology integration. So I've written on this a little bit before, especially China's application of AI and LLMs in the health setting, as well as its leading biotech landscape. I think for people that have been on the ground in China, its digital health landscape today is it's truly incredible. It's actually quite hard to describe what it feels like until you've seen it with your own eyes because the speed and level of integration in health and digital and the convenience of it all, whether you're a patient or a doctor or even a provider, it really feels like the future and pretty dystopian, especially, for example, when I travel back to the UK and compare it with how things are here and in Europe. In China, digital health, everything is now connected. And it's truly not an exaggeration. You can book same day appointments through your phone, see a specialist the same day, get scans and tests done within hours, and then access those results later, printed out or even again on your phone that same day. I think, especially in the UK, for those of us that are used to the NHS, and I practice with it as a doctor, but also experience it as a patient, the waiting lists are too long, weeks to months. So this kind of same day health technology integration and ability to access the care you need as a patient. It's truly incredible.
Um,
You can pick up prescriptions and then have them sent to your door too for convenience, and then also log your health insurance and reimbursement online as well. So obviously, I'm talking about all of this from the perspective of a patient in an urban city, maybe in China, and there's still huge variations between regions, especially remote areas, and poverty definitely still exists alongside world-class innovation within China's health diversity. But that paradox is exactly why what China's doing in digital health is so relevant for developing countries because for them, these lessons and experiences of leapfrogging traditional hospital and clinic infrastructure straight to digital, in order to overcome issues of lacking workforce, quality of care and access, it's hugely relevant for the global south. and they're drawn to how China links digital tools to financing, logistics, governance. So these new tech models for health delivery under constraint, even the West has never experienced or delivered before. So it's hugely exciting, hugely relevant for developing countries. We've already said a little bit about how these types of partnerships might come with standards and trade-offs. Chinese tech platforms might embed Chinese assumptions about data management, consent, infrastructure control, and digital privacy. But also, as we've talked about now, these developing governments are fully aware of this and choosing China's model quite consciously by weighing the pros and cons of speed, control, and practicality.
Yeah, and so just briefly, you mentioned LLMs, just for the non-health specialists amongst us. What are LLMs?
So, large language models, whether that's ChatGPT or other, China's been really shocking the world in its own domestically grown LLMs, including DeepSeek. Alibaba also has Qwen, Tencent, Baidu, JD Health have their own health LLM models. So generative AI. I mean, I'm not an expert in this. I only know the application of these in the health context, but really exciting potential in supporting clinicians with diagnosis, supporting patients with accessing the care they need, and supporting operational health infrastructure in logistics and efficiency.
And so this digital health technology transformation, has this been accelerated by the pandemic? Are there other key developments that have come about since then?
Yeah, I think that's exactly it. COVID was a huge turning point, not only for China, but for all countries around the world in terms of health and technology integration. We know that health is one of the sectors where it's most difficult for technology to integrate and often the slowest, and rightly so, because it's a sector where lives are at stake. The ethics of technological experimentation should be carefully regulated and implemented. But I think with COVID, the urgency of needing to ensure that health system was still running when we could not see each other, where we couldn't access care because of the restrictions, meant that pressure created opportunity. And I think for China, I would say that the opportunity pushed through in three main ways. Um, Even before COVID, health tech in China was already widely underway and faster than many other countries, but COVID pushed it into overdrive. So the smart hospitals and AI triage and online consultations we just talked about, all of that was massively accelerated. I remember before COVID in 2019, I did a consulting project on internet hospitals in China, and there were about 500 internet hospitals, these licensed online facilities which could deliver digital care in China. But post-COVID, I think in 2023, which was the last recorded number of internet hospitals, there were about 3,000. And now when I visit China, I think every single health physical, whether that's a clinic or a hospital, they will have an equivalent online platform. So that, acceleration is truly incredible to the point where I would say now health online digital infrastructure is now baseline, both in public and private health pathways, making China's digital health not only world leading, but now exportable, as we've just said, especially to global south countries facing scale and capacity constraints. I think, firstly, technology, but then secondly, industrial capacity. The pandemic reaffirmed China's long held belief in needing to promote its own self-reliance with, blocks in supply chains that we saw all around the world, China was moved to rapidly scale up its own local production, not just of PPE, vaccines, ventilators, and so on for its own use, but also for export. And China's ability now to produce and deliver health products, it views that as increasingly a pillar of national strength and therefore also a strategic tool now in global health diplomacy. And it's moving to actively embed this into its global health partnerships with developing countries, co-building plants, infrastructure, in the African continent, in Southeast Asia, and in Latin America. And then finally, I think the third part is geopolitics, because the pandemic really turned health into a strategic asset. It definitely put health into an area of greater political sensitivity than ever, of course. Health became part of health security. But at the same time, because many lower income countries were left stranded, waiting for vaccines, medical supplies, solidarity from the West that were promised but never came, China moved to send equipment, share tech platforms, open manufacturing partnerships, strategically resetting narratives and asserting leadership and building trust and deeper ties with the global South in ways that are remembered today.
Yeah, and so moving forward, what do you think are the key areas within this discussion of global health aid to watch?
Yeah, I think, looking forward, um, now and in the future, the global health landscape is undergoing rapid and significant change that is set to continue. And change and transformation is never painless, never simple. New systems are emerging, which are different and distinct from before. So, across my work now, whether that's advising and consulting through Lintris Health or writing my newsletter at China Health Pulse, my high level perception is that countries are being more deliberate, asking clearer questions, and most of all, choosing based on practical fit. So, what helps them move quickly, what helps them reflect their own priorities, and what gives them space to lead. So, always turning inwards first, being selfish first and foremost, and partnering selectively where it works for them. But this should be expected because I do think the traditional concept of multilateralism and global goods for all, it was always idealistic and it was never able to be implemented in real terms. Any type of partnership, whether between global north west or global south, was never fully neutral and for the benefit of the recipients. So the new partnerships that are forming today look different, but I think they still require careful alignments. Timelines are still shifting. Political coordination still plays an important role. But whether the partner is China or the US or Europe or others, I think that the focus should be on what's actually been built, whether that's in health policy or drug regulations or technical delivery. And this is where I try to spend most of my time when I'm analyzing all of this. I'm trying to follow the decisions that impact funding terms and governance structures and care models, because I think that these are the elements that are going on to influence how this will all shift over time and where trust and capability and legitimacy will be formed. And I think that's what will allow us to keep best understanding how global health is set to evolve over the next years. I think the World Health Assembly this year was really, a point where the global health experts, the stakeholders in this space, whether public or private sector, whatever country and member state was coming in to discuss or play a role, everyone was finally coming to realize that the past model of global health is kind of over, and it's a new age. I mean, maybe that sounds dramatic, but it's really a fundamental shift, and how it's all set to play out, we will have to watch and wait how all of these various agendas, overlapping choices being made every day will be implemented through different contexts. But what's definitely clear is that China's role will be increasingly significant, but we must not be viewing it through old contexts and templates, but viewing it as a distinct and new way of working.
Brilliant. Well, on that dramatic note, I think we will conclude there. Ruby, thank you so much for your time today. And if our listeners would like to read more about Ruby's work, you can find links to her articles in the podcast description. Thank you again and have a lovely day.
Thank you so much for having me. Great to talk to you, Eleanor.
Thank you.